We caught a car thief and tortured him with kindness until he begged for jail. I was in my garage at 3 in the morning trying to fix my motorcycle's carburetor when I heard the sound of breaking glass coming from across the street. My neighbor Dimitri's BMW had its window smashed, and some guy in a black hoodie was halfway inside trying to hotwire it. I should have called the police immediately, but something about the way he was fumbling with the wires made me think he wasn't very good at this. I pulled out my phone to record him instead, getting clear footage of his face when he looked up. That's when he saw me standing there with my phone out, and his eyes went wide with panic. He tried to run, but Dimitri's elderly dog Winston had wandered out through the open gate and was now blocking the driveway, wagging his tail like this was the most exciting thing that had happened all week. The thief tried to go around Winston, but the dog thought they were playing and kept moving to block him. It would have been hilarious if the guy wasn't actively trying to escape after breaking into a car. I yelled for Dimitri, who came running out in his bathrobe, looking confused and angry. The thief was now cornered between Winston, the BMW, and both of us, blocking the only exit from the driveway. He held up his hands and started backing away, saying he was sorry and he'd never done this before, which was obviously a lie based on the professional lockpick set I could see sticking out of his pocket. Dimitri looked at me, then at the thief, then at his smashed car window, and I watched his expression change from anger to something I couldn't quite identify. "Call police," he said in his thick Russian accent, but he was smiling in a way that made me nervous. I dialed 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher, who told me officers were on their way, but it might be 30 to 40 minutes due to a major accident on the highway. 40 minutes was a long time to stand in a driveway with a car thief. That's when Dimitri invited him inside for tea. The thief, whose name we learned was Kyle, looked absolutely terrified when Dimitri insisted he come inside to wait for the police. "It's cold out here," Dimitri said, putting his arm around Kyle's shoulders like they were old friends. "You break my window. Least you can do is have tea with me while we wait for police, yes?" Kyle looked at me desperately, like I might save him from whatever this was, but I just shrugged and followed them inside. I was curious now. Dimitri's house was exactly what you'd expect from a 68-year-old Russian immigrant who'd lived there for 30 years. Doilies on every surface, photos of grandchildren everywhere, and a smell of baking bread that never seemed to go away. Dimitri sat Kyle down at the kitchen table and started making tea, chatting casually about the weather, while Kyle sat there looking like he was waiting for a trap to spring. Winston settled at Kyle's feet, putting his head on the thief's shoe affectionately. This was already the weirdest crime I'd ever witnessed. Dimitri brought over 3 cups of tea and a plate of cookies he'd apparently baked earlier that day. He sat down across from Kyle and looked at him with genuine concern. "So, you are stealing cars now? This is what you do with your life?" Kyle stared at his teacup and mumbled something about needing money. Dimitri nodded thoughtfully and took a sip of his tea. "My grandson, he is about your age, 23, 24 maybe? He also makes bad choices sometimes, but he has family to help him, to guide him back to right path." He pushed the plate of cookies toward Kyle. "You have family?" Kyle's hands were shaking as he reached for a cookie, probably more from nerves than hunger. He admitted his mom lived in Nevada, and they hadn't spoken in 2 years. Dimitri made a disappointed sound with his tongue and shook his head. "This is problem. Everyone needs family. Everyone needs someone who cares if they make mistakes." I was sitting there drinking tea with a car thief and a Russian grandfather having a therapy session at 3 in the morning, wondering if I'd fallen asleep in my garage, and this was all a weird dream. Dimitri asked Kyle about his life, his childhood, what had led him to breaking into cars in suburban neighborhoods at 3 a.m., and Kyle, for reasons I still don't understand, started answering honestly. He talked about dropping out of community college, about his ex-girlfriend leaving him, about how he'd gotten into debt with some guys who weren't patient about repayment. The plan was to steal nice cars, drive them to a chop shop in the next county, and get enough money to pay off his debts and maybe start over somewhere else. Dimitri listened to all of this while pouring more tea and offering more cookies, nodding sympathetically like Kyle was describing a difficult day at work instead of multiple felonies. "This is very sad story," Dimitri said when Kyle finished, "but also very stupid plan. You know how much Chop Shop pays for stolen car? Maybe $2,000–3,000 if you are lucky? And you risk 10 years in prison for this? The math does not work out, my friend." Kyle looked like he hadn't actually thought about the math before, which honestly tracked with how bad he was at the actual car theft part. I checked my phone and saw that only 15 minutes had passed since I'd called the police. We still had at least 25 minutes to go. Dimitri seemed to be settling in for a long conversation, asking Kyle if he'd eaten dinner. When Kyle admitted he'd only had gas station coffee, Dimitri got up and started pulling things out of his refrigerator. "You cannot steal cars on empty stomach. This is definitely why you are doing such a terrible job at it." Within minutes, Dimitri was cooking eggs and sausage at 3 in the morning, humming to himself while Kyle sat at the table looking increasingly confused about his life choices. I texted my roommate Zara about what was happening because I knew she'd never believe me without real-time updates. She responded with a string of laughing emojis and "only in our neighborhood." Dimitri slid a full plate of food in front of Kyle and sat back down, watching him like a concerned parent. "Eat. You look terrible. When was last time you had real meal? Kyle picked up his fork hesitantly, looking at me like he was checking if this was allowed. I just shrugged again. Nothing about this situation was normal anymore. While Kyle ate, Dmitri started telling stories about his own youth in Russia, about the stupid things he'd done, the trouble he'd gotten into. I was not always respectable grandfather with nice house and BMW, he said with a laugh. When I was 20, I also made very bad choices. But I had people who helped me, who showed me there was different path. He leaned forward, looking at Kyle seriously. Question is not why you steal cars. Question is what kind of man you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. You want to be in prison, or you want to be person your mother can be proud of? Kyle stopped eating and just stared at his plate. I could see his jaw working like he was trying not to cry. This whole situation had gone from weird to emotionally intense, and I was just sitting there as a witness to this bizarre intervention happening in real time. Dmitri got up and came back with a photo album, flipping it open to show Kyle pictures of his own family. This is what matters. Not cars, not money. People who love you, who care about your life. You have thrown this away for what? For debt to criminals? For quick money? This is foolishness. By the time the police finally arrived, Kyle had eaten 2 plates of food, drunk 4 cups of tea, and was looking at Dmitri's family photos while the older man explained each person's story. I opened the door for Officers Ramirez and Liu, who looked confused when they walked into what appeared to be a pleasant social gathering instead of a detained criminal. This is man who tried to steal my car, Dmitri announced cheerfully, gesturing at Kyle like he was introducing a guest at a dinner party. He has terrible technique and also very sad life. I think he needs help more than he needs jail, but this is for you to decide. Officer Ramirez looked at me, probably hoping I could explain what was happening. I showed her the video on my phone of Kyle breaking the window and trying to hotwire the BMW, then gestured at the kitchen table where the evidence of Dmitri's kindness campaign was spread out. Empty plates, teacups, cookies, and photo albums. It's been an unusual night, I said, which felt like a massive understatement. Officer Liu was trying not to smile as she asked Kyle to stand up and put his hands behind his back. Kyle stood slowly, looking at Dmitri with an expression I can only describe as confused gratitude. I'm really sorry about your window, he said quietly, and thank you for the food, and the tea, and everything. Dmitri waved his hand dismissively. Window can be fixed. Your life? This is harder to repair. But maybe this is wake-up call, yes? Maybe you call your mother? You apologize? You start making better choices. Officer Ramirez was putting handcuffs on Kyle, but even she seemed moved by the whole situation. Officer Liu asked if Dmitri wanted to press charges, which was when things took another unexpected turn. Dmitri considered for a long moment, looking at Kyle like he was genuinely weighing his options. If I press charges, he goes to jail. He comes out worse than he is now, yes? More connections to criminals? More damage to his future. He turned to Kyle directly. But if I do not press charges, you must promise me something. You must call your mother today. You must tell her what happened, what you almost did, and you must ask for help. Real help. Not from criminals, from family. You understand? Kyle nodded so hard I thought his head might fall off. Officer Ramirez looked like she wanted to argue about the wisdom of letting a car thief go, but Dmitri held up his hand. I am victim, yes? I can choose, and I choose to give him chance. He pulled out his wallet and handed Kyle a business card. This is number for my nephew. He runs construction company, always needs workers. You call him tomorrow, you tell him Uncle Dmitri sent you. You work hard, you stay out of trouble, you rebuild your life properly. But if I hear you are stealing cars again, if I hear you are back to criminal life, then I will be very disappointed. And trust me, you do not want to disappoint me. The way he said it was somehow more threatening than any police warning could have been. Officer Liu looked at her partner and shrugged. It's his car, his choice, but we still need to document everything and do a background check. She turned to Kyle. You have any outstanding warrants we should know about? Kyle shook his head. This was my first time actually trying to steal a car. I've thought about it before, but tonight was the first time I actually broke a window. That explained his terrible technique. The officers ran Kyle's information and confirmed he had no prior record, just some traffic tickets, and a misdemeanor trespassing charge from 3 years ago that had been dismissed. Officer Ramirez pulled Dmitri aside and asked if he was absolutely sure about not pressing charges. This guy tried to steal your car. He's probably done this before even if he hasn't been caught. You're setting a dangerous precedent. But Dmitri just smiled and patted her shoulder. I am old man with good insurance and repair shop that owes me favor. He is young man with bad choices and no guidance. I think I can afford to try helping rather than punishing. Besides, if he steals again, you arrest him then, yes? But maybe he will not steal again. Maybe he will surprise us. Officer Liu finished her paperwork and handed Kyle a citation for criminal mischief and attempted theft, which would require him to appear in court even though Dmitri wasn't pressing charges. Consider this your official warning, she told Kyle. Next time, there won't be a nice Russian man with tea and cookies. Next time, you're going to jail. Kyle took the citation with shaking hands and nodded. There won't be a next time, I swear. Before the police left, Dmitri made them take photos of his smashed window and the damage to his car door, where Kyle had tried to force the lock. For insurance, he explained. And also, so I remember this night. After the officers drove away, the three of us stood in Dimitri's driveway as the sun started coming up. It was almost 5 in the morning, and none of us had slept. Kyle looked exhausted and overwhelmed, still holding Dimitri's nephew's business card like it was a winning lottery ticket. I don't understand why you're being so nice to me, he said finally. I tried to steal your car. I broke your window. You should hate me. Dimitri put his hand on Kyle's shoulder and squeezed gently. When I first came to America, I had nothing. No money, no job. English was terrible. Many people could have turned me away, could have made life harder, but some people chose to help instead. They gave me chances I did not deserve. This is what you do when you have good fortune in life. You pass it forward. You give chances to people who need them. Maybe you waste this chance. Maybe you go back to stealing cars. But maybe you do not. Maybe you become good man who helps someone else one day. This is gamble I am willing to take. Kyle left around 5:30, walking down the street toward the bus stop with his hands in his pockets and his head down. I watched him go, wondering if Dimitri's kindness would actually make a difference, or if we'd just let a car thief get away with attempted grand theft auto. Dimitri must have sensed my skepticism, because he turned to me and smiled. You think I am foolish old man, yes? You think he will steal more cars, and I have made mistake. I admitted that the thought had crossed my mind. Dimitri nodded thoughtfully. Maybe you are right. Maybe he steals again tomorrow. But also maybe not. And I think maybe not is worth trying for. Besides, what good does it do to send young man to jail? He learns to be better criminal. He comes out angry and desperate. He has record that prevents him from getting real job. This solves nothing. He had a point. Even if it went against every crime and punishment instinct I had. We said good night. Or good morning, rather. And I went back to my garage to finish working on my motorcycle. But I couldn't concentrate anymore. I kept thinking about Kyle's face when Dimitri asked about his mother. The way he'd looked at those family photos like he was seeing something he'd lost. 3 days later, I was getting my mail when I saw Dimitri outside washing his car, the same BMW that Kyle had tried to steal, now with a new window and the door lock repaired. He waved me over excitedly. You will not believe! Kyle called my nephew. He starts work on Monday. Dimitri was practically glowing with satisfaction. And even better, he called his mother. They talked for 2 hours. She is coming to visit next month. He is going to stay with her for a while after he saves some money. I felt something in my chest relax that I didn't realize had been tense. Maybe Dimitri's instinct had been right. Maybe kindness was more effective than punishment in this particular case. I asked if Dimitri was worried Kyle might tell other criminals about his response, that it might make him a target for people who thought he was an easy mark. Dimitri laughed and shook his head. You think I am soft because I give tea and cookies? Let them try. I have Ring camera now, and also I buy Louisville Slugger bat for if Ring camera fails. I can be kind and also prepared. These are not opposites. 2 weeks after the incident, I was in my garage again, this time actually making progress on my motorcycle, when someone knocked on the open door. I looked up and saw Kyle standing there, holding a small box. Hey, he said nervously. I hope it's okay that I came by. Dimitri gave me your address. Well, he gave me his address, and I remembered which house was yours from that night. I stood up, wiping grease off my hands with a rag, not sure what to expect. Kyle held out the box. I wanted to thank you for not making a bigger deal out of everything that night. You could have tackled me or held me down until the cops came, but you just recorded and called for help. I appreciate that. Inside the box was a bottle of decent whiskey and a handwritten note that said, thank you for giving me a chance to make better choices. I didn't know what to say. Kyle filled the silence. I'm working for Dimitri's nephew now. Construction work. It's hard and my body hurts all the time, but it's honest. And I called my mom. Like Dimitri said, we're talking again. She wants me to move back home, but I want to stay here for a while. Prove I can do this on my own first. We talked in my garage for about 20 minutes. Kyle told me about his new job, about reconnecting with his mom, about how he'd cut ties with the people he owed money to by moving to a different apartment and changing his phone number. I know running away from debt isn't the most responsible thing, he admitted. But these weren't exactly people who respond to payment plans. Better to just disappear and start over. He asked what I was working on, and when I explained the carburetor issue, he surprised me by offering some actually useful advice. Turns out he'd worked in an auto shop briefly before everything went wrong in his life. We spent another hour working on the motorcycle together, and he helped me solve a problem that had been frustrating me for weeks. When the bike finally started properly, he grinned like he'd won something. Thanks for letting me help. I needed to feel useful at something other than breaking into cars. After he left, I texted Dimitri. Kyle came by. I think your kindness experiment might actually be working. Dimitri responded with a smiley face emoji and, I told you so. A month after the attempted theft, Dimitri invited me and several neighbors over for dinner. It was a Saturday evening, and his house was full of people eating Russian food and drinking vodka that Dimitri insisted was not too strong, perfectly safe. Zara came with me, finally getting to meet the legendary Dimitri after hearing all my stories. Around 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door, and Dimitri answered it to reveal Kyle standing there with an older woman who had the same nervous energy. This is my mother, Patricia. Kyle said by way of introduction. Dimitri's face lit up, and he immediately pulled both of them inside, insisting they eat and meet everyone. Patricia looked overwhelmed, but grateful, as Dimitri explained to the room that Kyle was the young man I told you about, the one who tried to steal my car and got tea and life advice instead. Everyone laughed, and instead of it being awkward, it became this strange celebration of second chances. Patricia pulled me aside later in the evening. I don't know what you and Dimitri did that night, but you saved my son. He was heading down a path that would have destroyed him. Now he's working. He's calling me. He's actually planning for his future. Thank you. Kyle started coming around the neighborhood more often after that. He'd help Dimitri with yard work, fix things for elderly neighbors who needed repairs, and occasionally stop by my garage to help with motorcycle problems. He became this weird fixture in our community, the guy who tried to steal a car and ended up becoming everyone's handyman. 3 months after the incident, he got promoted to supervisor at the construction company. 6 months later, he enrolled in night classes at community college, taking business management courses. Every time I saw him, he looked a little more confident, a little more stable, like he was growing into the person Dimitri had seen potential for that first night. I watched this transformation happen in real time, watched someone's entire life trajectory change because one old man decided kindness was worth trying. It made me reconsider a lot of my own assumptions about crime and punishment, about what actually rehabilitates people versus what just cycles them through systems that make things worse. A year after the attempted theft, Dimitri threw a party to celebrate his grandson's college graduation. The whole neighborhood showed up, including Kyle and Patricia, who had moved to town to be closer to her son. I was standing by the food table when Kyle approached me with a beer. I've been meaning to tell you something, he said. That night, when Dimitri invited me in for tea, I thought you guys were insane. I thought maybe this was some elaborate setup to torture me before the cops came, or that you were going to beat me up inside where there weren't witnesses. He laughed at the memory, but then Dimitri just kept being genuinely kind. He kept asking about my life like he actually cared, and at some point, sitting at that kitchen table eating cookies, I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had treated me like I mattered, like I was worth more than my worst decision. He took a sip of his beer. That's what broke me. Not the threat of jail, not fear of consequences, just basic human kindness from someone I'd wronged. It made me want to be better because I didn't want to disappoint him. Weird, right? I told him it wasn't weird at all, that Dimitri had somehow figured out something that the entire criminal justice system seemed to miss, that people are more motivated by wanting to live up to someone's faith in them than by fear of punishment. Kyle nodded. I think about that night a lot. If you had tackled me, if Dimitri had pressed charges, if the cops had arrested me, my life would be completely different now. I'd have a record. I'd probably be in jail or just getting out. Instead, I have a job I'm good at. I'm going to school. My mom and I are actually close again. All because an old Russian man decided to make me tea and show me pictures of his grandkids. He paused, looking around at the party. I'm not saying everyone who commits a crime deserves this kind of response. I'm not saying I earned it or that it wasn't pure luck. But I am saying that sometimes kindness works when nothing else will, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to pay forward what Dimitri gave me. We clinked our beer bottles together, and I noticed Dimitri watching us from across the yard with that same satisfied smile he'd had the morning we let Kyle walk away. He raised his vodka glass in our direction, and we raised our beers back. 2 years after the incident, I was in my driveway working on my truck when a Tesla pulled up and Kyle got out. He was wearing a button-down shirt and nice jeans, looking about 10 years older in a good way, more mature, more settled. I have news, he said, grinning. I'm starting my own handyman business. I saved up enough money, and Dimitri's nephew is helping me get licensed and insured. I wanted to tell you in person because you were there that night. You saw me at my absolute lowest point, and you've watched me rebuild. I wanted you to know it actually stuck. I'm not going back to who I was. I asked him what he was going to call the business, and he pulled out a business card that made me laugh. Second Chance Repairs, with a tagline that read, "Everyone deserves good work and new beginnings." I told him it was perfect, maybe too on the nose, but perfect nonetheless. He laughed and said that was exactly what Dimitri had said when he showed him the design. I'm not hiding from my past anymore. I'm not proud of trying to steal that car, but I'm proud of who I became after. The business name reminds me every day why I'm doing this, because someone gave me a chance I didn't deserve, and now I want to give other people that same opportunity. Kyle's business took off faster than anyone expected. Turns out there was huge demand for a reliable handyman who actually showed up on time and did quality work. Within 6 months, he had hired 2 employees, both guys from situations similar to his own past, both getting second chances through his company. I watched him turn into not just a business owner but a mentor, teaching these younger guys the same lessons Dimitri had taught him. He'd bring them to community events, introduce them to potential clients, and help them rebuild their lives piece by piece. One evening, I was at Dimitri's house for our now regular Saturday dinner when Kyle showed up with his crew. "These are my guys," he said proudly. "This is Aaron, who was living in his car 6 months ago, and this is Deshaun, who had a record that kept him from getting hired anywhere else. They're learning the trade, earning good money, and staying out of trouble." Dimitri beamed and immediately started making tea for everyone. because of course he did. This is what I knew would happen, Dimitri said to me later. Kindness is not weakness. Kindness is investment. You invest in person's potential, and sometimes you get return beyond what you could imagine. 3 years after that night in the driveway, I was scrolling through social media when I saw Kyle had posted a long message. It was the anniversary of his attempted car theft, and he'd decided to share the whole story publicly. From breaking Dimitri's window to the tea and cookies, from the construction job to starting his own business. The post went viral, getting shared thousands of times. News outlets picked it up. People were debating in the comments whether Dimitri's approach was naive or brilliant, whether Kyle was an exception, or whether the criminal justice system could learn from this example. I watched the story spread across the internet, watched people argue about restorative justice versus punishment, about the role of community in rehabilitation. Kyle did several interviews where he talked about that night, always making sure to emphasize that he didn't think everyone in his situation deserved or would respond to the same treatment. I got incredibly lucky, he said in one video interview, but I also worked hard to earn that luck. Dimitri gave me a chance, but I had to take it. And that's the difference. The attention from Kyle's viral post led to something unexpected. Several academic researchers reached out wanting to study his case. They were fascinated by the practical application of restorative justice theory, by how one person's decision to show kindness had ripple effects throughout an entire community. One researcher, Dr. Yolanda Pierce from a university criminal justice program, came to interview all of us, me, Dimitri, Kyle, the police officers who responded that night, even Patricia. She was writing a paper about alternatives to traditional criminal prosecution for first-time offenders. What happened with Kyle shouldn't be remarkable, she told me during our interview. But it is, because our system is so focused on punishment that we've forgotten about the possibility of actual transformation. Your neighbor instinctively understood something that we're only now starting to prove with data, that for certain offenders, especially young ones without prior records, interventions based on compassion and community support are often more effective at preventing recidivism than jail time. Her paper was published 6 months later and cited Kyle's case as a prime example of successful community-based restorative justice. 4 years after the incident, Dimitri's health started declining. He'd been diagnosed with heart disease, and while he remained optimistic and cheerful, it was clear he was slowing down. Kyle became one of his primary caretakers, stopping by every day to check on him, help with tasks around the house, and just keep him company. I'd often come home to find Kyle's work van in Dimitri's driveway, and I'd go over to find them having tea and playing chess or watching Russian films together. The student had become the caregiver, and their relationship had evolved into something that looked a lot like family. One afternoon, I was there when Dimitri told Kyle he was proud of him. When I first saw you trying to steal my car, I saw a scared young man making terrible choice, but I also saw possibility. And you have exceeded every hope I had for you. You have become good man, successful man who helps others. This makes me very happy. Kyle had tears in his eyes as he thanked Dimitri for everything. You saved my life that night. You know that, right? If you'd called the cops and pressed charges, I'd be a completely different person now. Probably in and out of jail, definitely not running a business or helping other people. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. When Dimitri passed away 8 months later, surrounded by family and friends, Kyle was there. The funeral was huge. Everyone in the neighborhood came, plus Dimitri's extended family from across the country, former students from the English classes he'd taught for new immigrants, people whose lives he'd touched over his decades in America. Kyle gave one of the eulogies, talking about the night he tried to steal Dimitri's car and how one man's decision to offer tea instead of calling for immediate arrest had changed the entire trajectory of his life. Dimitri taught me that kindness isn't about being soft or naive, Kyle said, his voice breaking. It's about believing people can change and giving them the tools to do it. He didn't let me off easy. He held me accountable, made me face my choices, and insisted I work to rebuild my life properly. But he did it with compassion instead of condemnation, and that made all the difference. There wasn't a dry eye in the church, and afterward, at least a dozen people came up to me to share their own stories of Dimitri's kindness, of times he'd helped them when they needed it most. He'd spent his whole life investing in people's potential, and Kyle was just one of many who'd benefited from it. In Dimitri's will, he left Kyle a letter and a small amount of money with specific instructions. The letter, which Kyle showed me a few weeks after the funeral, said, "You were never my project or my charity case. You were a reminder that everyone deserves chance to become a better version of themselves. Take this money and use it to help someone else the way I tried to help you. Pay forward the kindness. This is how we make world better. One person, one choice at a time. I am proud of man you have become. Do not forget lessons you learned. Do not forget that change is possible. And do not forget to call your mother regularly. Love, Dimitri." Kyle used the money to start a small scholarship fund for people trying to rebuild their lives after making mistakes, helping with technical training costs, licensing fees, or business startup expenses for people who were working to turn their lives around. The first recipient was one of his employees, Aaron, who wanted to get certified as an electrician. The second was a young woman who'd been in and out of the system and wanted to train as a medical assistant. Kyle reviewed applications personally, met with every candidate, and tried to offer the same kind of supportive accountability that Dimitri had given him. 5 years after that night in the driveway, I was featured in a podcast about the incident. The host wanted to talk about what it was like witnessing Dimitri's unconventional approach to catching a criminal, and whether I thought it was something that could or should be replicated. I told them honestly that I didn't know if it would work in every situation or even in most situations, but that it had definitely worked in this one. I think what made Dimitri's approach successful was that it wasn't just about being nice, I explained. He held Kyle accountable, gave him concrete steps to improve his life, and followed up to make sure he was actually doing the work. It wasn't permissiveness, it was structured support, combined with genuine care. And Kyle responded to that because it gave him something he'd been missing, someone who believed he could be better. The podcast episode was downloaded over 100,000 times in the first week, and I got emails from people all over the country sharing similar stories of how kindness had transformed lives, or asking for advice on how to implement restorative justice approaches in their own communities. It became clear that people were hungry for alternatives to our current system, for stories that proved change was possible. Today, 7 years after Kyle tried to steal Dimitri's BMW, I'm sitting in my garage working on yet another motorcycle project when I hear a vehicle pull up. It's Kyle's work van, now wrapped with his company logo and a fleet number. He's up to 6 vehicles and 12 employees. He gets out with his son, a 3-year-old named Dimitri, who's currently obsessed with tools and helping with repairs. Uncle needs his oil changed, Kyle says, using the nickname his kid has given me. Thought we'd stop by and see what you're working on. We spend the afternoon together, little Dimitri helping by handing us the wrong tools and asking a million questions, while Kyle and I catch up on life. He tells me about the business expansion, about how he's been asked to speak at a criminal justice reform conference, about how Patricia is moving in with him and his wife to help with childcare. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, he says, while watching his son play with a socket wrench. 7 years ago, I was breaking into cars. Now I own a successful business, I have a family, I'm helping other people rebuild their lives. All because one old man decided to make tea instead of pressing charges. As the sun sets and Kyle packs up to head home, I think about the chain of events that started with me hearing breaking glass at 3 a.m. I think about Dimitri's instinctive kindness, about Kyle's willingness to accept help and do the work, about a community that embraced second chances. I think about all the ways it could have gone differently. If I'd been more aggressive in stopping Kyle, if Dimitri had been angrier and less forgiving, if the police had arrived faster, if Kyle had been less receptive to the intervention. There were so many points where this story could have ended with Kyle in jail instead of thriving. But it didn't, because one person chose compassion over punishment, and that choice rippled outward in ways none of us could have predicted. I'm not naive enough to think this approach works for everyone or in every situation, but I am certain enough to say it worked this time, spectacularly, and that's worth paying attention to. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do when someone wrongs you is to see their humanity and offer them a path back to it. And sometimes, just sometimes, they'll surprise you by taking it. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.